That was everything Nathan Cole had left in the world, not counting the eviction notice taped to his front door, not counting the empty orange prescription bottle on the kitchen counter, not counting the sound of his 7-year-old daughter coughing herself to sleep every night while he sat in the dark pretending he wasn't terrified. A former Navy SEAL who had survived ambushes, freezing oceans, and enemy territory couldn't figure out how to survive Chicago. Then a blizzard swallowed the highway whole, and his headlights caught something that didn't belong. A black Mercedes crushed against a tree at the bottom of a ravine, half buried in snow, and a hand pressed against the shattered glass. He almost kept driving. If this is your first time here, welcome. Stories like this one are why this channel exists. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what's coming next. And when you drop a like on this video, take 1 second to tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and it's worth every minute. The storm had been building since noon. By the time Nathan Cole's 2009 Civic was crawling north on I-94, the highway looked less like a road and more like something erased. The plows had given up hours ago. Other drivers had pulled off at the last exit, hazard lights blinking like distress signals, content to wait it out in their warm cars with their working heaters and their fully charged phones and their bank accounts that contained more than $3.17. Nathan didn't have that option. He had a shift starting at 11:30 at Midwest Distribution, a massive warehouse on the north edge of the city where he'd spent the last 14 months loading freight containers and trying not to think about what his life had looked like before. The job paid $19.40 an hour. It wasn't much. It was everything. Miss tonight, miss Christmas Eve, miss the one shift the floor supervisor had already warned him about. And he was done. No appeal, no second chance, just a termination slip and the long walk back to a Ford Civic that was also, technically, his backup plan for shelter. He gripped the wheel tighter and leaned forward like that would help him see through the white wall the world had become. The radio had gone mostly static. What cut through was a weather alert repeating on a loop. Historic winter storm, visibility near zero, travel strongly discouraged, all non-essential personnel. And Nathan had reached over and snapped it off because he didn't need a radio to tell him things were bad. He could feel it in the way the car shuddered when the wind hit broadside. He could see it in the guardrails half swallowed by drifts. He could calculate it with simple math. $3.17, one sick kid, one final warning from his supervisor, and approximately 42 miles between him and a paycheck. Sophie. He always came back to her. 7 years old and small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a laugh that sounded like she'd stolen it from someone much happier. She'd been diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis 14 months ago, which was the kind of diagnosis that doctors delivered quietly, in careful voices, while their hands stayed very still. The disease was rare in children. The medication that could slow its progression was not cheap. The insurance company that covered Nathan's warehouse position had denied the claim 4 times, each letter arriving in the same white envelope with the same logo, each one using slightly different language to say the same basic thing: not medically necessary at this time. Not medically necessary. His daughter's lungs were slowly scarring over, and somewhere in a glass office building, a person he'd never meet had decided that the medicine that could help her breathe wasn't medically necessary. The prescription bottle on the kitchen counter had been empty for 6 days. He was still making the hour-long drive to the warehouse at 11 o'clock on the worst night Chicago had seen in 30 years, because the alternative was worse. He almost missed the tire marks. They were fading fast, the snow was eating them. But his eyes caught the disturbance in the guardrail first. A section bent outward, metal crumpled in a way that wasn't weather damage. Then the marks themselves, 2 parallel gouges in the shoulder that disappeared over the edge of the embankment before the snow could cover them completely. He drove another 50 yards on pure momentum before something in his chest made him brake. The Civic fishtailed slightly. He straightened it, sat there. The hazards ticked. Snow hit the windshield and vanished. Keep going. The voice in his head was practical, not cruel. Just math. If someone went over that embankment in this storm, they were already beyond help, or they already had a phone and had already called 911, or both. Nathan calling 911 from a dead phone. He'd forgotten to charge it again. It was sitting at 4%. Wasn't going to help anyone. Getting to his shift, keeping his job, being able to pay for Sophie's next prescription when it came through. That was the version of tonight where people survived. He put the car in drive. Then he put it back in park. "Damn it," he said to no one. He grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, say the one he kept there from his old life, heavy aluminum, the kind that could double as a weapon, and got out of the car. The cold hit him like something physical, not weather, a presence. The wind was coming off Lake Michigan with nothing to slow it down, and it cut through his jacket like the jacket wasn't there. He'd worn worse. He'd been wet and frozen in places most people couldn't find on a map, and he'd kept moving then, so he moved now, following the guardrail gap to the edge and pointing the flashlight down. The Mercedes was maybe 30 feet below the highway, nose first against a tree line, the front end compressed into something that didn't look like a car anymore. Black. Recent model. The rear end was still mostly intact, one taillight still glowing a faint red through the snow accumulation, which meant the battery wasn't dead, which meant it hadn't been down there long. Nathan was over the guardrail before he'd consciously decided to go. The embankment was steep, and the snow was thigh-deep in places, and he went down half sliding, half climbing, using the flashlight as a probe to test the ground ahead. Twice he nearly went down completely. Once he grabbed a buried fence post that held. The cold was past unpleasant now. It was its own separate problem, the kind of problem that would become a serious problem in another 20 minutes if he didn't find somewhere warm. He reached the car and swept the flashlight across the driver's window. She was in the driver's seat. Young. He couldn't tell much more than that. Dark hair, face angled away from him, one arm braced against the steering wheel like she'd tried to hold herself upright and lost. The windshield on her side had crazed into 1,000 pieces but hadn't fully shattered, which was the only reason she wasn't already dead. There was blood on her temple. There was blood on the deflated airbag. Nathan tried the door, jammed. He moved to the passenger side, tried that one, and it opened with a sound like tearing metal. He leaned in. The interior was already cold enough that his breath fogged. "Hey!" He kept his voice level. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. He reached across and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Pulse was there, thready, too fast, but there. He checked her breathing, shallow. He shone the flashlight over her as quickly and carefully as he could, running the kind of survey he'd learned in a different life when the difference between a minute and 2 minutes was sometimes the whole game. Laceration on the temple, probably not arterial. Right wrist, swollen at the joint, possible fracture. No obvious neck deformity. She was breathing on her own. His phone was at 4%. He dialed 911. 3 rings, then, 911, what is your emergency? Vehicle off the road on I-94 northbound, approximately mile marker 61, down an embankment. 1 victim, female, unconscious, possible head injury. I need an ambulance. Sir, we have a significant backlog of emergency calls due to the storm conditions. Can you... How long? A pause. Typing. Estimated response time is currently showing between 90 minutes and 2 hours. Sir, can you... The line dropped. 4% became 0. Nathan stood there in the wreckage of an expensive car holding a dead phone while a stranger bled quietly beside him. 90 minutes. He looked at the woman. He looked at the embankment above him. He thought about hypothermia and what it does to an unconscious person in 30-degree temperatures with 40-mile-per-hour wind, and the answer was the same as what it did to a conscious person, just faster. He unbuckled her seatbelt. "Okay," he said, though she couldn't hear him. "Here's what's happening. I'm going to move you. It's going to hurt tomorrow, and you can be as angry about it as you want, but you're not staying here." He got her clear of the car carefully. He'd done casualty carries in worse conditions, though not recently, and the body remembered. Got her over his shoulder in a modified carry that kept her spine as aligned as he could manage. She was lighter than he expected. She made a small sound when he shifted her weight, which he took as an encouraging sign that someone was still home. The climb back up the embankment with another person was a different experience than the climb down alone. He went slowly. He planted every step. The wind was directly in his face now, and the snow had gotten heavier, and there was a moment somewhere in the middle of that slope where he stopped and breathed and didn't let himself think about how tired his arms were. Move. He moved. He got her over the guardrail. He got her into the back seat of the Civic, laid flat, and got in himself and got the heat running on high. He turned on the hazards and sat there for a moment breathing. Then he thought about the ambulance that was 90 minutes away. He thought about the nearest hospital, which was probably Advocate on the north side, maybe 20 minutes in good conditions. He thought about the road conditions, which were not good conditions. He thought about the woman in his back seat, who was still unconscious and who had stopped making sounds. And he made a decision that his brain presented as logical, but which was really just something older than logic. He couldn't get her to a hospital safely. Not tonight. He started driving south. His apartment was on the third floor of a building on South Paulina that had been scheduled for demolition before someone decided the word demolition sounded bad on the paperwork and changed it to redevelopment. The result was the same. Sometime after the new year, a company called Meridian Urban Partners was going to show up with legal paperwork, and the families inside were going to become a line item in someone's quarterly report. Nathan knew this because the eviction notice had told him so. 60 days, which had been 45 days ago. He parked as close to the entrance as the drifts allowed and got the woman up the 3 flights of stairs in a carry that left his legs shaking by the second landing. He got the door open. He got her inside. The apartment was small and cold enough that you could see your breath in the corners. The radiator worked intermittently. Tonight was an off night. He cranked the thermostat, knowing it would take a while, knowing the pipes had been unreliable since October. He put her on his bed, the only bed, the one Sophie wasn't using, and went to work. He had a kit. Not a medical kit, technically, but close enough. Butterfly strips, saline, gauze, an ace bandage, a blood pressure cuff he'd bought at a pharmacy 2 years ago when he was going through a phase of convincing himself he was being responsible about his health. He cleaned the laceration on her temple, which was uglier than it looked in the car. Head wounds bled dramatically, but this one wasn't dangerous, just messy. He wrapped her wrist in the AC bandage and elevated it. He took her pulse every 15 minutes and tracked it in his head. Around 1 in the morning, Sophie padded out of her room in her socks, holding the worn rabbit she'd carried since she was 3. She looked at the woman on her father's bed. She looked at her father. "Who's that?" she whispered. "Someone from a car accident. She's okay." He paused. "Mostly okay." Sophie considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who had spent too much time in waiting rooms and had developed a pragmatic relationship with the concept of okay. "Did you fix her up?" "I'm working on it." "Okay." She turned to go back to her room, then stopped. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Did you miss your shift?" He looked at her. There was nothing accusatory in the question. She was just asking. She knew what his shift meant because she was 7 years old and she'd learned things about money that 7-year-olds shouldn't have to know. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "I missed my shift." She nodded like she was filing this away and went back to bed without another word. Itipet. The woman woke up at 4:15 in the morning. Nathan was on the sofa with his jacket still on, not really sleeping, doing the thing he'd trained himself to do in the teams. Rest without losing awareness. Keep one part of the mind running surveillance while the rest went quiet. He heard the change in her breathing before she made any sound and was in the doorway before she spoke. She was sitting up, or trying to. She'd gotten her shoulders off the pillow and then the room had apparently changed her mind because she'd stopped there, one hand braced on the mattress, the other pressed to her temple. "Easy," Nathan said from the doorway. She turned toward his voice. Her eyes were dark, sharp. Whatever else the night had done to her, it hadn't touched her mind. She scanned the room the way someone does when they're doing a threat assessment, fast and systematic. Took in the water-stained ceiling, the dying plant on the windowsill, the child's drawing taped to the wall across from the bed. Landed on him. "Where am I?" Her voice was rough but controlled. No panic in it. "South Paulina. My apartment." He stepped into the room far enough to not be blocking the door. He'd learned a long time ago that putting yourself in a doorway read as a threat when the other person was cornered. "You went off the highway. I-94, near marker 61. I pulled you out of the car. She processed this. You're the one who... Yeah. Another silence. She was doing calculations. He could see it. The storm. Still going. Roads are bad. I called 911 before my phone died. They said 2 hours and then the line dropped. He shrugged. Figured you didn't have 2 hours. She looked at her wrist. The ace bandage, back at him. You wrapped this. It was either me or nobody. Are you a doctor? No. She waited. Former Navy SEAL, he said, in the flat tone he used when the information was relevant, but he didn't feel like making it into a story. She absorbed that. Most people made a sound or changed their expression. She just nodded once, like that explains it, and moved on. I had my phone, she said, in the car. Your car is at the bottom of a ravine under about 2 feet of snow by now. Even if I went back for it, it wouldn't be charged. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had shifted. Not visible exactly, more like a change in pressure. She'd made some internal decision. Claire, she said. My name is Claire. Nathan? Nathan. She said it like she was making a note. Thank you for not driving past. He pulled the desk chair over from the corner and sat down. Not too close. How's the head? It hurts. You've got a laceration, sutured as well as I could manage with butterfly strips. You probably have a concussion. The wrist is sprained, maybe fractured. You need an X-ray to know for sure. He paused. Anything else hurt that I might have missed? She moved her neck carefully, then her shoulders. Then she inhaled deliberately, feeling for rib pain. No, I don't think so. She met his eyes. You know what you're doing. I knew what I was doing, he said. I've been out of practice. She didn't push on that. They sat in the quiet of a 4 a.m. apartment while the storm pressed against the windows. Both of them strangers, both of them with places they were supposed to be and couldn't get to. And Nathan looked at the woman on his bed and tried to figure out what the morning was going to look like. He didn't figure it out. He went back to the sofa, pulled his jacket tighter, and told himself he'd deal with the morning when it came. It always came. The morning came gray and slow, the way Chicago mornings did after a bad storm. Not a sudden thing, just a gradual lightening of the dark outside the windows, the snow finally dropping to flurries, the wind backing off to something survivable. Nathan woke up on the sofa with his neck at a wrong angle, and his jacket twisted around him, and the immediate awareness that something was different about his apartment, which was how he'd always woken up in places where something could go wrong. Then he remembered. He straightened up, rolled his neck until something cracked, and looked toward the bedroom door, still closed. He could hear Sophie moving around in her room, the small sounds of her getting herself up, the creak of the floorboards he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. She'd learned to be quiet in the mornings. He'd never asked her to be. She just had. He went to the kitchen and ran the tap and waited for the water to come up from freezing. The radiator had finally kicked on around 3. He'd heard the pipes bang and hiss, and the apartment was warmer than it had been, though warm was doing a lot of work in that sentence. He had eggs. He had half a loaf of bread that was still good if you didn't look too hard at one end. He had the end of a jar of peanut butter and 2 bananas that were past their best, but not past eating. He made Sophie's breakfast first. That was the order of operations, always. She came out at 7:10, hair tangled, rabbit under her arm, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw him cracking eggs. Is she still here? Sophie asked. Far as I know. Sophie went to the bedroom door and put her ear against it the way kids do, openly, completely without self-consciousness. I can hear her breathing, she announced. Good. Is she going to be okay? Nathan slid the eggs onto a plate and set it on the table. Sit down and eat. Sophie sat. She poked at the eggs with her fork. You didn't answer. I think so, yeah. She's tough. He paused. Eat? She ate. He stood at the counter and drank black coffee. The cheap kind. The kind that tasted like it was trying its best. And looked at the window where the snow had piled against the glass in the night and was now catching the pale morning light. The street below was buried. No plows yet. A few figures moving slowly through the drifts bundled to the eyes. He thought about his phone. He'd have to go down to the corner store when it opened and ask to charge it, which was something he'd done before and would do without embarrassment, because embarrassment was a luxury. He needed to call the warehouse. He needed to find out if he still had a job, or if he needed to start recalculating everything from the beginning. The beginning, in this case, being essentially zero. He heard the bedroom door open behind him. Claire stood in the doorway in the clothes she'd been wearing the night before, a dark wool coat now draped over her arm, charcoal slacks, a silk blouse that had not had a good night. She'd done something with her hair, pulled it back somehow. The butterfly strips on her temple were still in place. Her wrist was held close to her body. She looked like someone who had made a deliberate decision to appear more put together than she was, and who was mostly succeeding through sheer force of will. Her eyes went to Sophie first. Sophie looked back at her with the direct, unblinking assessment that children deploy before they learn to pretend they're not staring. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hi." Claire's voice was different in the morning, less guarded, or maybe just not yet fully assembled. "You must be his daughter." "Sophie," she pointed her fork at him. "He's Nathan, but you probably already know that because you were in his room." Claire's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Claire," she said. "Do you want eggs?" Sophie asked. "He made too many. He always makes too many." Nathan looked at the pan. He had made exactly the right number of eggs, which was more than he was going to eat because he'd been doing the math on food since the week before last. "She can have mine," he said, which was not quite a lie. Claire looked at him. He kept his expression neutral. "I'm not going to take your breakfast," she said. "I'm not hungry." She looked at him for a moment longer, and something moved behind her eyes. Not pity, he decided. More like recognition. The look of someone who understood the arithmetic of what he'd just said and didn't want to make it worse by arguing. "Coffee then," she said. "If you have it." He poured her a cup and slid it across the counter without ceremony. She took it with her uninjured hand and drank it without asking about cream or sugar, which told him something, though he wasn't sure what. She stood at the counter and looked around the kitchen. He watched her do it. Not intrusively, just aware. She was taking things in. The water stain on the ceiling above the window, the cabinet door that didn't fully close, the prescription bottle on the counter, empty, with Sophie's name on the label. Her eyes stayed on that bottle a beat longer than the other things. "How old is she?" Claire asked quietly. Sophie had gone back to eating and was now reading the back of a cereal box she'd brought to the table from somewhere. 7. "What's the medication?" He hesitated for half a second. "Lung disease. The insurance denied the claim." He said it the way he said everything about it, flat, without editorial, because he'd found that adding emotion to the explanation didn't change the outcome and exhausted him in a way he couldn't afford. Claire nodded slowly. She didn't say "I'm sorry," which he appreciated more than she could know. Everyone said "I'm sorry." And then the conversation ended, because what was there after sorry? Nothing you could deposit. "How long has she been off the medication?" 6 days. A pause, the coffee cup between her hands. She wasn't looking at him now. She was looking at the bottle. "Is she... she's stable." He said it before she could finish because the sentence ending in dangerous or getting worse was one he'd been not finishing for a week. "She's okay right now." Claire set the cup down. She seemed to be working out something internal. Then she looked at him directly. "I need to make some calls. My phone's dead." "I know. Is there a landline in the building?" He thought about it. "The super has one. First floor, apartment 1B. His name is Marty. He's usually up by 7:30. She nodded. She set the coffee cup in the sink carefully, with both hands because the wrist made single-handed carrying awkward, and Nathan noticed the way she adjusted without complaining or drawing attention to it. She picked up her coat. Then she stopped. "The building," she said. She wasn't looking at anything in particular. "The eviction. When did you get the notice?" He leaned against the counter, looked at her. "Why?" "I'm asking." 45 days ago. 60 days total." He crossed his arms. "Company called Meridian Urban Partners. You know them?" Something in her expression shifted. Small. He might have missed it if he hadn't been trained to watch faces in situations where a change in expression was sometimes the only warning you got. She knew the name. He was sure of it. "I've heard of them. she said. He let that sit there, let her carry the weight of it. She didn't say anything else. She went to find Marty. He didn't learn the truth about Claire Harrington that morning. He learned it sideways, in pieces, the way you learn most things that matter. The first piece came from Marty, who was 71 years old and had lived in the building since 1987 and had a habit of delivering information the way people deliver furniture, without particular concern for where it landed. Nathan went downstairs an hour after Claire had gone to use the phone, partly to charge his cell and partly because he wanted to know what she'd said. Marty was in the hallway outside his apartment, jacket on, salt bucket in hand, ready to attack the front steps. "Your lady up there made 4 phone calls," Marty said without preamble. "She's not my lady. Whoever she is, she made 4 calls. 1 was short, 3 were long." He set the bucket down and studied Nathan. "She in trouble?" "Car accident." Marty had the incurious expression of a man who had seen enough things in 71 years that very little surprised him anymore. "She called someone named Dennis first, said she was safe and to lock something down. I didn't hear what. Then she called someone named Ray, which was the long one. Real long. Serious voice." "What did she say?" "I wasn't listening." Nathan looked at him. "I heard some things while I was getting my jacket on," Marty amended. "Something about board members, something about making sure records didn't disappear." He picked the bucket back up. "She's not just a regular person, is she?" "I don't know what she is," Nathan said, which was true. The second piece came from Sophie, which he should have expected because Sophie had spent an hour alone with Claire while Nathan was downstairs. And Sophie talked to people the way she did everything, directly, without scaffolding, interested in whatever was actually there. He came back upstairs to find Claire sitting on the sofa and Sophie sitting beside her, the worn rabbit between them, showing Claire a drawing she'd made of their old apartment in Wicker Park, before the marriage ended, and the diagnosis came, and the series of smaller and smaller places began. "Dad used to have a guitar," Sophie was telling her. "He doesn't play it anymore." "How come?" Claire asked. "He sold it," Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact. "For my medicine, but I wasn't supposed to know." Nathan stopped in the kitchen doorway. Claire didn't look up, but he could see the set of her shoulders change, just slightly. "Did you tell him you knew?" Claire asked. "No. It would make him feel bad." Sophie considered the drawing. "Sometimes you don't say things so other people don't feel bad." That's true." Claire said it quietly, and there was something in her voice that wasn't performance. Nathan stood in the doorway and felt like he was witnessing something he hadn't been invited to, and stepped back into the kitchen to give it space. The third piece came after noon, when the storm had finished and the streets were starting to show the first signs of plow activity, and Claire came to find him at the kitchen table where he was working through the bills, organizing them by urgency the way you do when there's not enough money to address them by urgency, which is a different kind of math. She sat down across from him. She didn't ask what he was doing. She could see what he was doing. "I need to tell you something," she said. He put the bills face down on the table. "Okay." She was quiet for a second, gathering herself, he realized. Not nervous, deciding something. "My name isn't just Claire. It's Claire Harrington." He waited. "Harrington Global. I'm the CEO." The name landed. He'd heard it, not personally, but the way you hear a weather system's name before it arrives. Harrington Global was investment, development, construction. One of the bigger private firms in Chicago, the kind that shaped neighborhoods from a distance and called it progress. He'd heard it in the context of the eviction, actually. Meridian Urban Partners. He'd looked it up when the notice came, done the research that broke people's hearts when they did it, traced the company structure back through holding companies and subsidiaries. He remembered now. One of Meridian's parent investors. Harrington. He looked at her. "The redevelopment project," he said. "This building." She met his eyes. "Meridian is a Harrington Global subsidiary, yes." The kitchen was very quiet. From Sophie's room he could hear the small sounds of a child playing by herself, the low murmur of a story she was telling her rabbit. "So you signed the order," Nathan said. "I signed the project approval, yes." She didn't flinch. I reviewed aggregate reports, projected returns, zoning compliance. I didn't know the specifics of what it meant for the families inside. That's a nice way to put it. I know. She said it without defensiveness. It's also honest. I'm not trying to make it sound better than it was. I'm telling you what happened. He leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling where the water stain had expanded since October, into something that now looked vaguely like a state he couldn't identify. He thought about the 60-day notice and what came after it. He thought about where he would take Sophie. He thought about the warehouse job that probably didn't exist anymore. "Why tell me?" he said. "Because you saved my life, and you deserve to know whose life you saved." He brought his gaze back down to her. "That's not the real answer." She held his look. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. "No," she said finally. "It's not the only one." She reached into the inner pocket of her coat, which was folded over the back of the chair beside her, and drew out something unexpected, a business card, which she must have had in her coat pocket through the whole crash, the whole night, the whole morning. She set it on the table between them. Claire Harrington, Chief Executive Officer, Harrington Global. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up. "I'm going to fix the eviction," she said, "for this building. Before I do anything else when I get back to the office, I'm going to freeze it." "You think that makes it even?" "No, I don't think anything makes it even." She was very still. "I think it's what should have been done before I signed the approval without understanding what I was approving." He pushed the card back across the table toward her. Not a rejection exactly, more a refusal to be filed. "Why did you come off the highway last night?" Her expression changed, first time she'd looked anything other than controlled since she'd sat down. "Someone ran me off," she said. He waited. "His name is Victor Lang. He's the deputy chairman of my company." She said it with the particular flatness of someone who has processed a betrayal far enough to report it without falling apart, but not so far that the flatness is easy. "I discovered yesterday evening that he's been diverting funds. $52 million over 18 months, moved through shell companies that I'd approved for different purposes." She paused. "When I told him I had the records and I was going to the board, he made a phone call. I was off the highway 40 minutes later. Nathan absorbed this. He tried to kill you. He tried to make me disappear in a way that would look like a weather accident." She said it clinically. "While I was gone, he was planning to call an emergency board session, declare me incapacitated or missing, and appoint himself interim CEO with emergency powers. By the time anyone realized what had happened, he'd have moved enough through the company structure to be untouchable. Your security chief, Dennis. I called him this morning. He's collecting the records now." She finally reached out and picked the business card back up, turned it in her fingers. "Victor thinks I'm dead. I'd like to keep it that way until I'm ready to walk into that building." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the kind of people who moved that fast, made a phone call, arranged for a car to force someone off a highway in a blizzard. He'd known people like that in a different context, in places where that was just the way things worked. "You're not safe," he said. "No. If he thinks you're dead and you make contact with anyone who then makes contact with the wrong person, I know." She looked at him steadily. "Dennis is the only person I've told that I'm alive. I trust him completely." She paused. "I need a day, maybe 2, until the roads are clear enough and he has enough documentation secured. You're asking to stay here." "I'm asking if I have a choice," she said. Not manipulatively, just honestly. "I have no phone, no way off this street, and a man who thinks I'm dead who will correct that situation if he finds out otherwise." Nathan sat with that. He looked at the bills stacked face down beside his elbow. He thought about the woman across the table from him who had signed the paper that was going to take his home, who had also apparently been nearly murdered the night before by someone she'd trusted, and who was now sitting in his kitchen asking him, not with any particular drama, just flatly, practically, to let her stay. "The sofa's not comfortable," he said. She blinked. "I'll manage. I'm not giving up my daughter's bed. I would never ask you to." He stood up and put the kettle on because he needed something to do with his hands. "There are rules," he said. "Sophie's routine doesn't change. You don't stress her out. If she asks you something, you answer her honestly. She's a kid, but she's not stupid, and she knows when adults are lying. Understood. And you don't... He turned around to face her. Do whatever it is you were about to do last night when you offered to fix the eviction. You don't try to make this into a transaction. You stay here because you need somewhere to stay. That's all it is. Claire looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. He turned back to the kettle. The second day was harder in some ways and easier in others. Harder because the apartment was small and they were strangers, and the forced proximity that a blizzard creates is different from the comfortable proximity of people who have chosen each other's company. Easier because Sophie, who had no concept of awkward, treated Claire's presence as simply a fact of life to be organized around. She showed Claire her drawings. She explained with great thoroughness the complete history and emotional biography of the rabbit, whose name was apparently Marcus and who had been through, as Sophie put it, a lot. She asked Claire approximately 47 questions over the course of the afternoon on subjects ranging from whether Claire had ever been to space, no, to whether she thought fish had feelings, possibly Sophie thought yes, to why her shoes cost so much. That last one landed in the kitchen while Nathan was making lunch. He heard Claire's pause from the other room. They're expensive because I bought them without thinking about what they cost, Claire said. Why didn't you think about it? Because for a long time I had enough money that I stopped paying attention to prices. Sophie considered this. My dad always looks at prices, she said. He checks the tag on everything, even if it's something small. He put back a bag of oranges once because they went up 50 cents. He sounds careful, Claire said. He sounds worried, Sophie said, with the accuracy of someone who has been watching adults very closely for a long time. Nathan stared at the sandwich he was making and said nothing. Claire came into the kitchen 20 minutes later while Sophie was in the bathroom. She stood beside him at the counter and kept her voice low. The medication, she said. The prescription that was denied. Yeah. What's the drug? He told her. She was quiet. I know someone on the Midwest Insurance Board, she said. Not a friend. A professional acquaintance. No? He said it without heat, but without any room in it either. Nathan, I said no. He turned to look at her. I understand you want to help. I understand you think this is something you can fix with a phone call because most things in your world are something you can fix with a phone call. But Sophie's situation is not a favor I'm going to owe someone. You wouldn't owe me anything. I'd know. She'd know eventually. He turned back to the sandwiches. There's a process. I'm working it. I have an appeal filed. Claire was quiet for long enough that he thought she'd dropped it. How long has the appeal been filed? She asked. 3 months? Another silence. All right, she said, and went back to the living room. But he heard something in her voice when she said it. Not agreement, not defeat. Something more like a decision made in a direction he couldn't see yet. He didn't push on it. He'd learned, over the last year and a half, not to push on things he couldn't afford to hope for. He finished the sandwiches and called Sophie out of the bathroom, and the three of them ate lunch around a table that was too small for even 2 people comfortably, and Sophie talked the whole time about a book she was reading about a girl who trained wild horses, and Claire asked questions about the horses with what appeared to be genuine interest, and Nathan ate half his sandwich and wrapped the other half in a napkin and stuck it in the refrigerator for later, and nobody mentioned the prescription or the eviction or the man who thought Claire Harrington was dead at the bottom of a ravine on Eat 94. Some things you carry while eating, some things you put down for 30 minutes because a kid is talking about horses, and she's 7 years old and she shouldn't have to feel the weight of everything that's pressing on the people around her. Nathan put it down. He watched Sophie explain with complete seriousness that the horse in the book was misunderstood, and that most difficult things were misunderstood if you didn't take the time to understand them, and Claire listened like she was actually hearing it. And outside the window the sky had cleared to a pale winter blue, and the snow on the street below caught the afternoon light, and Nathan thought about the morning and the jobs he needed to look for and the appeal that had been pending for 3 months. And he thought about Claire Harrington sitting on his second-hand sofa eating a sandwich and listening to his daughter talk about horses. He thought about the eviction notice folded in the kitchen drawer. He thought about the name on the approval order. He thought, people are complicated, which was not a profound thought, but it was the one he had, and it was true. And sometimes the true ones were the only ones worth keeping. He got up and cleared the plates. The second night was quieter than the first. Nathan gave Claire his blanket without making it into a thing. Just folded it and set it on the arm of the sofa when she wasn't looking, the way you do when you don't want someone to feel like a burden, but you also can't pretend the apartment wasn't 48 degrees before the radiator finally committed. She found it there and didn't say anything either, which he appreciated. Some kindnesses survive longer when nobody names them. He slept on the floor beside the sofa with his jacket as a pillow, and Sophie slept in her room with Marcus the rabbit and the particular density of a child's sleep that no amount of adult noise could penetrate. Claire, he suspected, didn't sleep much at all. He heard her shifting on the sofa in the small hours, heard her breathing change the way a person's does when their mind won't release them. Once, around 3 a.m, he heard her get up and stand at the kitchen window for a long time, just standing there looking out at the street below. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. Some things were private even inside 40 square feet of shared space. By the third morning, the city was functional again in that grudging way Chicago had, the plows having worked through the night, the main roads cleared to a dirty gray slush, people moving through the streets in the determined, forward-leaning posture of people who had been through worse and were already late. The storm had lasted long enough to feel permanent, which made its ending feel slightly unreal. Claire made the call to Dennis at 7:15 from Marty's landline. Nathan didn't go with her. He stayed in the kitchen and drank his coffee and listened to Sophie explain why Tuesday was better than Monday, which was a position Sophie held with great conviction and which she had supporting evidence for, and tried not to think about what was happening one floor below him. She came back 20 minutes later, and he knew from the way she walked through the door that something had moved. "He has everything," she said. "Transaction records, wire transfers, the shell company documentation. He also has something we didn't expect." She set Marty's spare key on the counter with more care than a spare key required, which he'd noticed she did with objects when she was working through something, gave them more attention than they needed. Victor called a board session for this afternoon. Emergency session. He's telling them I'm missing and that the company needs stable leadership during the uncertainty. "He's moving faster than you thought." "Yes." She looked at the window. "I need to be in that building before 2 o'clock. He thought about the road conditions. He thought about the 7 or 8 miles between South Paulina and the Harrington Global Tower on West Monroe. He thought about his Civic, which had made it through the storm largely because he'd angled it between a dumpster and a parked truck, and the drifts had buried it in a way that was also, accidentally, protective. "I can get you there," he said. She looked at him. "Nathan, you don't have to. You said you needed to be there before 2. He set his cup down. "My car's outside. Roads look passable. I can get you there in 40 minutes. He shrugged with one shoulder. "Unless you've got another option." She didn't have another option. They both knew it. "What about Sophie?" "She stays with Marty. She's done it before. He's got a TV that actually works and he lets her eat cereal for lunch, which I pretend I don't know about." He raised his voice toward the living room. "Bug." Sophie appeared in the doorway. "Yeah." "Can you spend the morning with Marty?" She looked at Claire, back at her father. Something moved through her expression that was more understanding than a 7-year-old should have had, and which she wore the way she wore most things, without making anyone feel bad about it. "Is it important?" "Yeah." "Okay." She disappeared back into her room to get her shoes. Claire watched this exchange with an expression Nathan couldn't fully read. Not pity, something more like taking inventory, filing something away in a place she'd return to later. They dropped Sophie at Marty's at 7:45. Sophie went in without ceremony, already talking to Marty about the horse book before the door was fully open. Nathan stood in the hallway for a second longer than he needed to, listening to her voice, making sure it stayed bright, then turned and went back to the stairs. The drive to West Monroe was the first time they'd been alone together in a way that felt genuinely private. The apartment didn't count because the apartment also contained Sophie, and Sophie was a presence even when she was in her room. The Civic was cold for the first 10 minutes, the defroster working on the windshield in slow, determined strips. Nathan leaning forward slightly, the way he always did when visibility was limited, even though leaning forward accomplished nothing practical. Claire sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap, her wrists still wrapped, her coat buttoned to the throat. She'd done her hair again somehow, working with what the apartment's bathroom offered, which wasn't much. She looked, Nathan thought, like a person who had decided to be a CEO again, and had committed to that decision fully, regardless of the bruise along her temple or the ACE bandage or the fact that her coat had dried blood on the cuff that she'd been unable to fully remove. She looked like someone who'd walked through something and kept going. He drove. The radio worked intermittently, some sports talk station that kept cutting to static. He left it on because the silence might have been too much. About 15 minutes in, somewhere on the Kennedy, where the snow walls on either side of the highway were taller than the Civic's roof, Claire said, "You're going to lose the warehouse job." He'd known this. He'd been keeping it in a separate room in his head, behind a door he hadn't yet decided to open. "Probably," he said. Don't." His voice was flat but not unkind. She stopped. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "And I understand why you're going to say it. But whatever you're planning to do after you walk into that building today, and I understand you need to do it, and I'm not asking you not to, it doesn't have anything to do with my job. You missed your shift because you pulled me out of a car. I missed my shift because I made a choice." He checked his mirror, changed lanes around a slow-moving salt truck. "Those are different things." She was quiet for a moment. "You're very stubborn. I've been told. Is it a military thing?" "It's a Nathan Cole thing." He glanced at her sideways. "My ex-wife would say the military just gave it structure." Something softened slightly in Claire's expression. "You don't talk about her." "Nothing to say. She left when Sophie was 3. The diagnosis came 6 months later." He said it evenly, the way you say things that have been rolled smooth by time. "She couldn't handle the diagnosis. I don't say that as a condemnation. I almost couldn't handle it either, and it was happening to my kid, not to me. Some people aren't built for that kind of weight. She knew it before I did." "But you stayed." "She's my daughter." He said it simply, as if no other explanation was possible because none was. Claire looked out the passenger window at the snow-banked highway sliding past. "My father built Harrington Global from a firm with 12 employees," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone deciding to trade. Not a manipulation, just an exchange. "I told you something true. Here's something true from me. He ran it for 30 years. When he died, I was 26 and not even close to ready. The board wanted to bring in an outside CEO. I told them to give me 18 months to prove myself. And they did. They gave me 12. The most condescending 12 months of my life." She turned back from the window. "I learned very fast that the room would not be quiet for me the way it was quiet for my father. So I made noise until they couldn't ignore it. And then I made money until they couldn't afford to. And somewhere in there you stopped reading the files carefully," Nathan said. It wasn't gentle. She flinched slightly, a real flinch, not performance. "Yes," she said, "somewhere in there." He didn't push. He'd said it because it was true, and she was smart enough to know it was true, and anything more would be piling on, and he wasn't in the business of piling on. They drove the rest of the way in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite conversation, the radio cutting in and out, the Civic handling the slush better than it had any right to. He pulled up in front of the Harrington Global Tower at 8:53. The building was glass and steel, 40 stories, the kind of Chicago architecture that meant to be imposing and succeeded. There were 2 black SUVs pulled up in the drop-off zone that did not look like they were there by accident. Claire looked at the building through the windshield, looked at the SUVs. "Dennis," she said, "those are his. Your security chief." "Yes." She was very still for a second. He recognized what it looked like. Not fear, but the last moment before the moment. The breath you take when the door is in front of you and what's behind it is real. He'd been there more times than he could count, in different contexts, in different countries, and you never got used to it. You just learned not to let it stop you. She reached for the door handle, stopped. "Nathan." She said his name differently than she had the last 2 days. Less like a data point, more like something she'd chosen. "Whatever happens in there, I need you to know that I understood what you meant about the transaction. You're right. I did it. I signed things I didn't fully examine, and it cost people who had less capacity to absorb that cost than I ever thought about. He looked at her. "I'm not saying it to manage you," she said. "I'm saying it because you've had me under your roof for 2 days, and you fed me, and you let your daughter get attached to me, and you drove me across town, and you haven't asked for anything, and that's—" She stopped, started again. "That's not something I've experienced a lot. People not wanting something from you? People not taking anything," she said. "Even what's offered." He thought about that. Then he said, "Go do what you need to do." She got out of the car. She didn't look back, but he saw her shoulders go back and her chin come up as she walked toward those SUVs, and he sat there and watched until the glass doors of the building had closed behind her and she was gone. He put the Civic in drive and went to figure out if he still had a warehouse job. He didn't. The floor supervisor, a compact, hard-eyed man named Briggs, who had been running that warehouse floor for 11 years and had the approximate emotional warmth of a load-bearing wall, told him in 43 words, which Nathan counted, that his position had been filled. The no-show policy was in the employee handbook. He was welcome to apply again in 90 days. Nathan thanked him. He picked up his last check from HR, which covered the 14 hours he'd worked in the previous week, and which came to $269.40 after taxes. He put it in his jacket pocket and drove back to South Paulina and sat in the parked car for 7 minutes before going inside. He didn't tell Sophie. She was back from Marty's by lunchtime, and he made grilled cheese on the cast iron, the one piece of cookware he'd kept from the Wicker Park apartment because it had been his mother's, and they ate at the table and Sophie asked if Claire was coming back and Nathan said he didn't know. "I liked her," Sophie said. "Yeah." She asked good questions. Sophie peeled the edge of her sandwich in that way she had. "Grown-ups usually ask boring questions. How's school? What's your favorite color?" She looked up. "She asked me what I was afraid of." Nathan set his sandwich down. "What did you say?" "I said I was afraid of not being here long enough." Sophie said it without drama, the way kids say the things that would devastate adults, directly, because they haven't yet learned to soften what's true. "I didn't mean it sad. I just meant there's a lot of stuff I want to do and I want enough time to do it." He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, small hands, crumbs on her chin, the rabbit on the chair beside her because it had table manners and could join them if it sat properly. "What did she say?" he asked. She said that was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. Sophie picked up her sandwich again. Then she looked out the window for a while. I think something I said made her think about something. Nathan picked his own sandwich back up and ate it, and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say, and because his throat had done something that he needed a moment to address privately. Claire called the apartment landline. Marty let him use the number for messages, at 4:15 that afternoon. Nathan took the call in the hallway outside his door, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, hearing her voice and noting that it was different now. Not warmer exactly, more weight-bearing, like a structure that had been tested and found sound. "It's done," she said. Victor was removed from the building at approximately 2:30. The police took him at the board meeting. I'm told he said a number of interesting things on his way out. Did they hold? The documentation is solid. Dennis had been watching him for longer than I realized. He'd had his own suspicions and hadn't told me yet. A pause. That's a conversation I'll be having with Dennis separately. The board. Shaken. Some of them are going to be difficult. 3 of them knew Victor well enough that his arrest is a personal blow, not just a professional one. But the numbers are clear and the board responds to clear numbers. Another pause. Longer this time. I also addressed the Southside redevelopment. He was quiet. I suspended all eviction actions tied to the Meridian project, effective immediately. The demolition permits are on hold pending a full review that I'm going to oversee personally. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that he'd come to recognize. The note that appeared when she was saying something she'd arrived at through difficulty rather than calculation. I should have done this before any papers were signed. I don't say that as a press release. I say it to you because you're the reason I can see it clearly. What changed? He asked. The prescription bottle, she said. On your counter, Sophie's name on the label. She stopped, collected herself. I've looked at thousands of project reports, demographics, displacement projections, relocation assistance frameworks. I approved a project that displaced 43 families from that building and the two adjacent, and I looked at those families as a demographic aggregate. Your daughter's name on an empty prescription bottle made them into people. Nathan stared at the hallway wall. There was a crack in the plaster that ran from the baseboard to about shoulder height, and he'd been meaning to fill it, and he thought about that crack and all the other things he'd been meaning to fix. "That's a low bar," he said finally. "I know." No excuse in it, just agreement. "You froze the eviction for this building. What about the others?" "All of them. Every property in the Meridian portfolio. The review will take time, but nothing moves until it's complete." She hesitated. "There's also something in motion regarding Sophie's insurance appeal. I want to be clear. I did not call anyone. What I did was pull the claim file and document 4 instances of procedural error in the denial process that constitute grounds for mandatory review under Illinois insurance regulations. That documentation went to the state insurance commissioner's office this afternoon from a public filing." He breathed through his nose. "Claire, I didn't pull a string. I filed a public document that any attorney could have filed." Her voice was careful. "Your appeal is still yours. I just made sure it was visible." He wanted to be angry about it. He tried on the feeling and found it didn't fit properly. Because she was right. It was a public process, and he'd known about the procedural angle and hadn't had the time or the bandwidth to pursue it, and his daughter needed to breathe. He let the anger go without giving it much ceremony. "Thank you," he said. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't." He switched the phone to his other ear. "I'm saying it anyway." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, the kind that happens when two people have been through something together that doesn't have a clean category. "There's one more thing," Claire said. "Okay. I want to come back to the building, tomorrow. I'd like to speak with you. And with the other tenants, if they're willing, not with a PR team, not with a lawyer, just me." She paused. "I think I owe people a face." He thought about the tenants on his floor. The Okafor family in 3C, 6 people in a 2-bedroom, both parents working 2 jobs each. The woman in 2A, who he only knew as Mrs. P, who was 81 and had lived in the building for decades, and who he suspected had nowhere else to go. The young couple on the first floor with the new baby, and the eviction notice taped right next to the one on Nathan's door. "I'll ask," he said. "I'm not making that promise for anyone else." "That's fair." "Come in the morning," he said, "around 10. People are more likely to be home and less likely to be in a bad mood." 10. He could hear her writing it down. Old habit, maybe. The kind of person who wrote things rather than typing them. "Nathan." "Yeah." "I'm going to offer you money tomorrow," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I know how you feel about it. I know what you said. But I'm going to offer it anyway because I'm not capable of walking in there and not trying to make something right in a concrete way." Her voice was straightforward, no apology in it. "I want you to know it's coming so it doesn't feel like an ambush." He almost laughed. It wasn't funny exactly, but there was something in the directness of it that caught him sideways. The warning before the thing that might cause offense, the transparency she hadn't shown him the first night. "I appreciate the warning," he said. "I'm learning," she said simply, and got off the phone. She came at 10 the next morning, alone. No car service, no security detail, no assistant with a tablet. She took a cab to South Paulina and walked through the front door of the building in a long wool coat and boots that had mud on them from the slushy sidewalk, and she stood in the lobby, such as it was, a mailbox bank and a radiator and a single overhead light that buzzed, and she waited. Nathan had gone door to door the night before. Some people were at work. Mrs. P came down in her housecoat and slippers and sat in the plastic chair Nathan had brought from the 3rd floor. The Okafor family sent the father, Emeka, a big quiet man with careful hands who listened to everything and spoke rarely, and when he spoke, it meant something. The couple from the 1st floor, Jake and Raina, came with the baby asleep in a carrier against Raina's chest and stood with their arms touching the way people do when they're trying not to show how scared they are. There were 9 tenants total in the lobby. Nathan stood at the back. Claire looked at each of them in turn. She didn't open with a prepared statement. She just said, "I signed the approval that put eviction notices on your doors. I did it without meeting you or understanding what it would mean for you. I'm here to tell you that the evictions are suspended and the demolition permits are on hold, and I'm here because you deserve to hear it from the person who made the mistake, not from a company letter." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Emeka said, in his careful voice, "And next month? Next year? The building is still old. The company still wants the land." "Those are legitimate questions," Claire said. "I don't have complete answers yet. What I can tell you is that no one will be moved from this building without a genuine alternative. Not a relocation check and a hope for the best. An actual place to go that's comparable to where they are now. That's a commitment I'm making in this room." "People make commitments in rooms," Mrs. P said. She had the particular authority of someone who had outlived several different eras of promises. "Then they go back to their offices and they forget the room." "Yes," Claire said. "They do." She didn't argue with it. "I can't prove in advance that I won't. You'll have to watch what I do." Mrs. P studied her for a long moment with the assessment of someone who had been evaluating people's character for 81 years and was very good at it. Then she said, "All right," which in her register meant something closer to "you have one chance." The meeting broke up in pieces, people drifting back to their apartments, Emeka shaking Claire's hand before he went. A firm, serious handshake that meant he was watching. Jake and Raina left without saying much, the baby still asleep, Raina glancing back once from the stairs. That left Nathan and Claire in the lobby. She reached into her coat pocket and drew out the check. Folded once. She held it out to him. He looked at it. He thought about Sophie's prescription bottle. He thought about $269.40, which was what the 14 hours he'd worked the previous week had come to after taxes, and which was currently the entirety of his financial position in the world. He thought about the guitar he'd sold, which had been his father's before it was his. He thought about what it would mean to take that piece of paper. Not practically. Practically, it would mean Sophie's medication and 4 months of rent and breathing room he hadn't had in over a year. He knew what it would mean practically. He'd done that math before she arrived. He thought about what it would mean to him, to Nathan Cole, to a man who had spent 14 months learning how to hold on to himself when everything around him was trying to shake him loose. He reached out. He knocked it from her hand. Not violently. He wasn't that person. But deliberately. The check fluttered to the linoleum and lay there between them. Claire stood very still. "I know what you're doing," he said, "and I know you mean it differently than it feels. But this is the part where you find out that I'm not going to let you buy your way clean." His voice wasn't raised. He'd learned a long time ago that you could say hard things at normal volume. You signed a paper without reading it carefully, and you called it business, and 43 families had to figure out where they were going to go. You were almost murdered by a man you trusted. You've had 2 days in an apartment that your company was going to demolish, and now you want to write a check and call it settled. I know it's not what you think you're doing," he said, "but look at what you're holding." She looked at the check on the floor. "The people in this building," Nathan said, "don't need your money right now. They need the thing you promised Mrs. P in there. They need you to still be paying attention in 6 months when something else needs your signature." He bent and picked the check up off the floor and held it back out to her. "Put this in a fund for the tenants when you figure out what the building actually needs. Not as a payment, as a starting point." She took the check, looked at it, then looked at him. "You turned down $250,000, she said. "I didn't turn down anything. I redirected it." "Most people? I'm not most people," he said. "And you know that, or you wouldn't have given me a warning call last night." Something happened in her expression. It was subtle, the way real things usually were. Not a movie moment, just a small rearrangement, like a weight shifting. Like she'd been expecting him to behave a certain way and he hadn't, and the not having had changed something she wasn't ready to name. "Do not trust what I say," she said quietly. It was almost to herself. "Watch what I do." "That's the first honest thing that's come out of this since you woke up in my bedroom," he said. She almost laughed. It was brief, barely there. Surprised out of her, not performed. Then it was gone. She put the check back in her coat pocket. They stood in the lobby of a building that was still standing because a former Navy SEAL had missed a shift on the worst night of the year, and the radiator buzzed, and somewhere above them a child was explaining something to a rabbit with great seriousness. and outside the window the street was gray and cold, and the snow that remained was the kind that had been walked on too many times to be beautiful anymore. "Okay," Claire said. It wasn't agreement or surrender. It was the sound of someone deciding to mean what they said. She turned and walked to the front door. She pushed it open. The cold air came in for a second before it closed again behind her, and Nathan stood in the lobby and listened to her footsteps on the front steps, and then the street. And then they were gone. He stood there a moment longer. Then he went upstairs to his daughter. He spent the next 3 days doing what people do when the structure of their daily life collapses. He made it through each one. He woke up, made Sophie breakfast, walked her the 6 blocks to school, even though the sidewalks were still treacherous because she liked when he walked her, and he wasn't going to stop doing it just because he had nowhere to be afterward. He came back to the apartment, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the job listings on his laptop, and applied for things. Warehouse work, mostly, because that was what was available in December, and that was what he knew, though he'd also sent 2 applications to security firms that did corporate work, which paid better and which his background suited, and which he'd been avoiding for a year because the corporate world felt like a different planet from the one he'd been living on. He didn't hear from Claire. He hadn't expected to. She had a company to rebuild, and a criminal case to cooperate with, and a board full of people who were either frightened or opportunistic or both. And she'd walked out of his building on a gray morning and said, okay, like it was a promise, and then she'd gone to do the work that came after promises. He thought about her more than he wanted to. Not in a simple way, not the way you think about someone you're attracted to, though there was something in that direction that he acknowledged privately and didn't examine closely. More the way you think about a problem that hasn't resolved. She occupied a space in his mind where unfinished things lived. On the 4th day, Sophie's pediatric specialist called. Nathan was in the kitchen when his phone rang, the number belonging to Dr. Patricia Wynn at Northwestern's Pediatric Pulmonology Department, which was a department Sophie had been on the waiting list for since the previous spring. He answered and stood very still while Dr. Wynn explained that Sophie's case had been flagged for urgent review following new documentation submitted to the state insurance commissioner, and that Northwestern had identified a patient assistance pathway that, combined with the insurance appeal now under mandatory review, could cover Sophie's medication costs with no gap in treatment. She asked if Nathan could bring Sophie in the following Tuesday. He said yes. He said it in a voice that sounded mostly like his normal voice, and then he got off the phone and sat down on the kitchen floor, which was not something he'd planned to do, just where he ended up. The linoleum was cold and the refrigerator was humming, and outside he could hear a plow going up the street scraping the last of the post-storm ice. He sat there for maybe 4 minutes. Then he got up, because Sophie was going to be home from school in 2 hours, and he needed to figure out what he was making for dinner, and the floor didn't solve anything. He didn't call Claire. He sent a message through Marty's line and left it at that. 2 sentences, thanking her, telling her about Tuesday. It wasn't enough, but he didn't know how to make it more without opening something he wasn't ready to open. She sent back 4 words through the same relay. Tuesday is a good day. Which, given what Sophie had said at the lunch table about Tuesdays, meant Claire had been paying attention in a way he hadn't given her credit for. He put the phone down and started on dinner. The call from Claire's office came the following Monday morning, a week and 2 days after the storm. Not from Claire directly, from an assistant named Priya, who had the careful, slightly formal voice of someone delivering a message she'd been given specific instructions about. She said that Ms. Harrington had asked whether Mr. Cole would be available for a meeting at Harrington Global on Wednesday of that week, and that Ms. Harrington had specified it was not urgent, not a legal matter, and that he should feel no obligation whatsoever to attend. The no obligation whatsoever had Claire's fingerprints on it. He could hear her saying it to Priya, making sure those exact words were used. He said he'd be there. Apasem. The Harrington Global Tower on West Monroe looked different in the daylight, from a car that you'd parked yourself rather than dropped off in a rush under the supervision of armed security vehicles. Nathan stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at it. 40 floors of glass and steel, the kind of building that had been designed to communicate permanence and authority and which succeeded at both. The lobby had a security desk with 2 men who were better dressed than most of the people Nathan had worked alongside for the last 14 months. He gave his name. He was expected. They gave him a visitor badge and an escort to the elevator, and the elevator opened directly into a reception area on the 32nd floor that had a view of the lake on clear days, though today was not a clear day. Today was the flat gray of Chicago in late December, the lake invisible behind cloud cover, the city below looking like a charcoal sketch of itself. Priya met him and walked him through a corridor that had the particular quality of spaces where money is spent not to look like money is being spent. Quiet carpets, understated lighting, art on the walls that Nathan couldn't have named, but which gave him the impression of having been chosen by someone who understood art as a statement rather than a pleasure. He was not nervous. He didn't quite know what he was. Claire's office was at the end of the corridor. Priya knocked, opened the door, and stepped aside. The office was large without being ostentatious. One wall was mostly windows, the gray lake view. The desk was solid and clear except for a laptop and a legal pad covered in her handwriting. She was standing when he came in, which he noticed because she could have been sitting, and the choice to stand was either courtesy or habit or some specific thing she'd decided. She looked better than the last time he'd seen her. The bruise on her temple had faded to a yellowish shadow. The wrist was out of the ace bandage. She was in what he supposed was her working armor, dark blazer, dark trousers, a watch he hadn't seen before, and she looked like a CEO in her own building, which was true. And she also looked, underneath that, like the woman who had sat on his sofa eating a sandwich while Sophie explained horses. Both things were true at the same time. He was getting used to that about her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the specific instruction about no obligation." The corner of her mouth moved. Priya delivered it correctly, word for word. She gestured to the chairs across from her desk, not behind the desk itself, but a small sitting area off to the side, 2 chairs and a low table, the kind of arrangement that said, "This is a conversation, not a briefing." He sat. She sat across from him and didn't open with anything preamble heavy, which he appreciated. "Victor's arraignment was last Thursday," she said. 52 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of conspiracy to commit assault, pending additional charges related to the accident. She said accident with the particular care of someone whose lawyer had instructed her on language. "He'll be in pretrial detention. His attorney is already negotiating. How does that affect you?" The board has concerns. Some of them are genuine. The fiduciary failures on Victor's watch raise questions about internal oversight that are fair questions. Some of them are opportunistic. She crossed her legs and looked at the legal pad on her desk, then back at him. "I have allies, and I have people who are watching to see which way the wind blows. That's not unusual. That's always been the reality. But it's harder now. Everything is harder now." She said it without complaint, just as fact. "The South Side review is underway. I've brought in an external firm, not one of our usual partners, to audit the Meridian portfolio. The tenant relocation framework we were using was inadequate and in 2 cases may have violated city ordinance. We're in conversations with the city about remediation." Nathan leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "The building on Paulina. The other buildings." "Paulina is being transferred." She watched his face when she said it. "The title. I'm working with the city and a nonprofit housing partner to convert it to a tenant-owned cooperative. The residents would hold equity. The building gets renovated, properly, not cosmetically. And the costs are structured so existing tenants aren't priced out by the improvements." He was quiet for a moment. "How long does that take?" 6 to 8 months for the legal structure. Renovations would start in spring, done in phases so people don't have to leave." She paused. "It's not the fastest solution. A faster solution would mean cutting corners, and I'm not cutting corners. Not on this." He looked at her. He thought about Mrs. P and her housecoat and slippers. He thought about Emeka Okafor's handshake and what it had meant. "They need to hear it from you directly," he said. "Not through a letter, not through a housing nonprofit's newsletter." "I know, I'm planning to come back." She held his look. "I told you to watch what I do." "I'm watching," he said. She nodded. Then she picked up the legal pad and set it on the table between them, turning it so he could see. He looked at what she'd written. His name was at the top. Below it were several lines of notes that read less like a formal document and more like someone thinking on paper. Phrases, questions, arrows connecting things. Operations Division. Need someone who understands field conditions, not just metrics. Community impact layer, currently invisible in all reporting. What does accountability look like from inside? He looked at the notes. He looked at her. You had this written before I came in, he said. I've been thinking about it for a week, she said. I didn't want to put it in the invitation because I didn't want it to look like the agenda. The agenda was to talk to you. This is, she paused, chose the word carefully, a question I wanted to ask in person. Ask it. She took the legal pad back. I need someone inside this company whose job is to see what I'm missing, she said. Not a consultant, not an auditor. Someone who comes to the board meetings and the project reviews and the acquisition conversations, and who asks the questions that don't make it into the executive summary. What does this mean for the people on the ground? What are we not seeing because we're not looking? What are the consequences that don't appear in the financial projections? She looked at him steadily. I want you to understand that I've had advisors who told me things were fine when they weren't, and I've had a deputy chairman who stole $52 million, and what I don't have is someone who will walk into a room and tell me I'm wrong. Nathan was quiet. He thought about Briggs, the warehouse supervisor, delivering 43 words of termination without looking up from his clipboard. He thought about 14 months of loading freight in the dark, of doing work that was fine and sustainable and entirely invisible, and of knowing the whole time that he was built for something that required more of him but not having a clear line to it. He thought about what it would mean to sit in the rooms where decisions were made, what it would mean to be the thing that complicated the clean answer. I have no corporate experience, he said. I know. I don't have a business degree. I don't have an MBA. I don't know how to read a balance sheet beyond the basics. I'm not asking you to read balance sheets. I have accountants. She leaned forward slightly. I'm asking you to read rooms, to read decisions, to read the space between what a proposal says and what it does to actual people. She paused. You did that in my lobby. You did it in about 10 minutes with 9 people you'd never met. He didn't say anything. I'm offering you a position, she said. The title can be whatever you want or nothing at all. The salary would be significantly more than what you were making at the warehouse. You would have direct access to me and to the executive team, and you would have, contractually, in writing, not just my word, the authority to raise any concern about any initiative without fear of professional consequence. He looked at the view through her window. The flat gray lake, invisible. The city in charcoal. You want someone to tell you when you're wrong, he said. I want someone brave enough to, she said. Those aren't the same thing. Plenty of people can see when someone's wrong. Most of them don't say it. He thought about Victor Lang, about a man who had sat in this same building, in probably the same kind of meeting, and had known exactly what to say and when to say it, and had understood that the performance of trustworthiness was more professionally useful than trustworthiness itself. What stops me from becoming Victor? He said. It wasn't a rhetorical question. He meant it as a diagnostic. She looked at him. The question had landed somewhere real. He could see it. Victor wanted the company, she said finally. He always wanted the company. Everything he said and did was in service of that want. She leaned back slightly. What do you want, Nathan? He thought about it honestly. I want Sophie to be okay, he said. I want to be able to look at myself. He paused. I want to do work that means something. None of those require you to take anything from me. He sat with that. She let him sit with it, which was something he'd noticed about her. She'd learned, in the last week or somewhere in the years before it, not to fill silence. Most executives couldn't do that. They'd been trained to read silence as a negotiating gap and fill it immediately. I'd want to see the offer in writing before I said yes, he said. The part about raising concerns without consequence. That has to be specific. My lawyers drafted it yesterday, she said. I had them do it before I sent the invitation because I wanted you to be able to see it today if you asked. He looked at her. You were pretty confident I'd ask. I was confident you wouldn't say yes without it. A pause. Different thing. He took the written offer home and read it at the kitchen table that night after Sophie was in bed, the apartment quiet, the radiator doing its reliable work for once. He read it 3 times, which was not because it was complicated, but because he'd learned that agreements had weight and you should feel that weight before you signed anything. The language was specific. His right to raise any concern regarding any company initiative to any level of management, including the board, without disciplinary action or modified compensation, was written into the employment contract as a protected function. There was a 30-day review period in which either party could exit without cause. There was a salary figure that would have made Nathan laugh, except nothing about this particular moment felt like laughing. He thought about what it would mean. He thought about the warehouse, the loading dock, the freight containers at 11:30 at night. He thought about who he'd been before and who he'd become in the 14 months since, and the question of whether those two things could exist in the same life or whether you had to pick. He thought about Sophie, upstairs with the rabbit, lungs slowly healing now that the medication was starting again, explaining to no one in particular, probably, why Marcus had feelings that deserved consideration. He called Claire's direct line, which she'd put on the last page of the document in her own handwriting, not printed. She answered on the second ring. It was 11:15. "You're still at the office," he said. "I sleep here some nights." She said it without self-pity, just information. "That's not healthy." "I know. Do you have questions about the document?" He looked at it on the table. "One condition," he said. "Tell me. The first time I raise a concern and someone in that building tries to manage me instead of answer me. I mean the first time someone schedules a follow-up meeting to discuss my concerns as a way of not addressing them. I walk. No negotiation, no exit package discussion." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear, faintly, the city through whatever window was near her desk. "That's a hard line." "Yes." "All right," she said. "I'll have it added." He picked up a pen. He didn't sign yet. The amended version needed to come first. But he put the pen down on the document in a way that meant something, at least to him. "One more thing," he said. "Okay. I'm not your redemption project. You've said that. I'm saying it again because I need to know you heard it the first time, and it didn't just go in and get filed under things Nathan said that I'll work around later." A silence. Then something he hadn't expected. She laughed. Not the brief surprise thing from the lobby. A fuller sound, genuine, the kind that came from being caught. "I heard it," she said, "the first time and the second time." A pause. "You're not my redemption project, Nathan. I don't need a symbol. What I need is a man who'll sit in a boardroom and tell me when I'm looking at something wrong." "I can do that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I asked." The board meeting where it really started, was 3 weeks into the new year, the Christmas decorations gone from the Harrington Global lobby, the city in the gray deadpan of January, everyone moving through it with the grim efficiency of people who'd made peace with the weather and were waiting for it to break. Nathan sat in the boardroom for the first time and understood immediately that he was being assessed. He'd been assessed before, in different contexts, and the mechanics were the same regardless of the room. The people who looked at him too long, the ones who didn't look at him at all, the particular quality of attention that meant, "What are you doing here and do you belong?" He wore the same dark jacket he'd worn to every serious thing in his adult life. It was clean and it fit, and it was not a suit, which he'd discussed with Claire beforehand. "A suit says I'm trying to be something I'm not," he'd told her. "A suit says you understand the professional context," she'd said. "I understand the professional context. The jacket says I'm not pretending I've always been in it." She'd looked at him for a moment. "Fair," she'd said, and dropped it. Around the table were 12 board members and a rotation of senior executives. Nathan had been given a seat at the far end, not at the foot of the table, just off to the side, close enough to see everything, distanced enough that he wasn't in the primary line of sight lines. He'd chosen the chair because it was the one that gave him the widest view of the room, and old habits had their own gravity. The agenda item that changed things came in the second hour, presented by a man named Carter Blythe, who ran strategic development and who had the particular confidence of someone accustomed to his presentations being received well. He was maybe 50, silver-haired, with a presentation style that was technically excellent and emotionally inert. The proposal was called the Midwest Operations Modernization Initiative. It had charts. It had projected cost savings over 5 years. It had a line item called workforce transition, which was doing a significant amount of heavy lifting in a small amount of space, and which, Nathan had read in the pre-meeting materials, covered the elimination of 1,200 warehouse and distribution positions to be replaced by automated systems. Blythe walked through the financials. The numbers were real. The savings were real. The efficiency gains were real. The projected return within 36 months was real. When he finished, Claire looked around the table. Her eyes found Nathan's briefly. Not a signal, just a registration. And then she said, "Questions?" Two board members asked about implementation timelines. One asked about the capital expenditure. One asked about the vendor contract for the automation systems. Nobody asked about the 1,200 people. Nathan had told himself he would wait. He told himself he would read the room first, understand the dynamics, not walk in on day one and blow everything up. He'd had a whole internal conversation about playing the long game. Then Carter Blythe clicked to the slide that said workforce transition, manageable near-term friction with positive long-term equilibrium, and Nathan stopped having the internal conversation. "Can I ask something?" he said. The table looked at him. Some of them were surprised he'd spoken. Carter Blythe had the expression of a man who'd been interrupted mid-performance and was deciding how to feel about it. "Of course," Claire said. Nathan looked at Blythe. "The 1,200 people. How many of them are over 55? Blythe blinked. "I don't have the precise demographic breakdown in this. Ballpark. Approximately 30%, I believe. So around 360 people who are old enough that finding equivalent warehouse work is going to be genuinely difficult, not friction." He kept his voice level. "What are their healthcare situations? How many of them are on the company plan as their primary coverage?" A pause. "I'd have to pull that data." "What about the single-parent employees? Do you know how many of the 1,200 are the sole income earner for a household with dependents?" Blythe looked at him with the expression of a man who recognized a different kind of intelligence than the one he'd been prepared to deal with. "Mr. Cole, the workforce transition plan includes a severance package and access to a retraining program. What does the retraining program cover? General vocational skills and does it cover the gap in healthcare while they're retraining? Does it cover mortgage payments? Does it pay for childcare while they're in a retraining program that presumably happens during business hours?" Nathan wasn't raising his voice. He'd made a decision a long time ago that raised voices were for emergencies, and this was not an emergency. This was a conversation that needed to actually happen. "I'm not saying the automation doesn't make financial sense. I'm saying this presentation describes the human consequences as manageable without demonstrating any specific knowledge of those humans or their actual circumstances." The room was very quiet. Carter Blythe was looking at his presentation clicker. One of the board members, a woman named Judith Faraday, who Nathan had assessed in the first 10 minutes as someone who said little and heard everything, said, "What would you need to see, Mr. Cole, to consider the human impact adequately addressed?" He looked at her. He liked her immediately for the directness. "Names," he said. "Not all 1,200. A representative sample. I want to know who we're talking about before we vote on what happens to them. I want someone from this team to have sat across from some of these people and understood what the transition actually means in their specific lives." He paused. The automation might still make sense after that, but the decision should be made with full information about the full cost. Right now, this presentation only shows half the cost. The room sat with that for a moment. Claire said, "I'm tabling the vote pending a supplemental impact assessment. Carter, I'd like a human capital review within 30 days. Not a demographic summary, an actual review, which means someone from this team speaks with workers at each of the 3 facilities." She looked around the table. "The financial case is sound. I want to make sure the implementation plan is sound in the same way." Carter Blythe nodded. He looked, Nathan thought, less offended than he'd expected. Maybe just recalibrating. Judith Faraday caught Nathan's eye briefly across the table. Something in her expression that wasn't quite approval, but was in the direction of it. The meeting moved on. There were other agenda items. Nathan sat at the end of the table and listened, and twice more said something, and both times Claire let it land without managing it, without redirecting it, without any of the corporate softening he'd half expected from someone running a 40-floor company with a board full of people who were still deciding whether to trust her. He walked out of the building at 4:15 into January air that cut through his jacket like it had a personal grievance. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about the room he'd just left, about the 1,200 names behind the word transition, about Carter Blythe's presentation and the slide that called human lives manageable friction. He thought about Sophie's prescription bottle, empty on the counter of a third-floor apartment on South Paulina. He thought, this is what you do with what you survived. Not a clean thought, not the kind of thought that made him feel settled or satisfied, just a true one, offered up by some part of him that was past the point of waiting for something better. He put his collar up against the wind and walked to his car. That evening, Sophie showed him a drawing she'd been working on all week. She did this sometimes, presented finished work at dinner like an artist unveiling something at a gallery, the rabbit positioned as a secondary audience member. The drawing was of a highway, dark crayon sky, white crayon snow. She'd pressed hard enough that the white stood up off the paper. A small car at the top of the highway with a figure inside it. At the bottom of the page, barely visible under layers of blue and white, the crushed rectangle of a car against a tree. And between them, the road, and a figure halfway down the embankment, moving toward the wreck. She'd titled it in careful 7-year-old letters at the top of the page. The Night Daddy did not drive away. Nathan looked at it for a long time. "Do you like it?" Sophie asked, fork in hand, genuinely uncertain in the way she only was when something had cost her something to make. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "I like it a lot." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her dinner. Marcus the rabbit sat upright in the adjacent chair, facing the drawing, which Sophie had propped against the centerpiece, a mason jar with a candle in it that was the most decorative object Nathan owned. He looked at the drawing through the rest of the meal. He thought about a woman who was alone in her office right now, with a city spread out below her, rebuilding a company and keeping a promise to a building full of people she'd met one morning in a lobby, and doing it without asking anyone to call it forgiveness. He thought about how badly things could break and still be worth the repair. He cleared the plates. He washed them. He helped Sophie with the reading she'd been assigned, which was a story about a girl who moved to a new town and couldn't figure out where she fit, and he read it with her until she fell asleep with the book on her chest and Marcus tucked under her arm. He turned the light off and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while, looking at the street below. The same street, the same building, different enough from 3 weeks ago that he couldn't quite locate the seam between the before and after. He thought, you don't always get to choose the moment that changes things. Sometimes you just don't drive away. He went to bed, and the radiator ran all night without stopping, and in the morning there was still work to do. Winter broke the way it always does in Chicago. Not gracefully, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week in February followed by a freeze that was almost insulting. March arriving with the kind of wind that made you question every decision that had led you to this city. Then, somewhere in the first week of April, a morning that was different. Not warm, exactly, but the cold had lost its conviction, and the light had changed in a way that was hard to name but unmistakable to anyone who had survived another Chicago winter and knew what the other side of it felt like. Nathan noticed it on a Tuesday, walking Sophie to school. She noticed it too. Stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, face turned up, eyes closed, just standing there with the morning light on her. "It's almost warm," she said, like she was reporting something official. "Almost," he agreed. She opened her eyes. "My lungs feel better in almost warm." He looked at her. 8 years old now. Her birthday had been in March, a small party in the apartment with Marty and the Okafor kids and a cake that had leaned slightly to the left, because Nathan had learned a long time ago that he was not a baker and had chosen to proceed anyway. She was taller than she'd been in December. The medication was working, the way Dr. Wynn had said it would work. Not a reversal, not a miracle, but a slowing, a stabilizing, a buying of time that was also a buying of life. Sophie's color was better. She coughed less in the mornings. She was arguing more, which Dr. Wynn had told him was a positive developmental indicator and which Nathan chose to believe. "Come on," he said. "You'll be late." She fell into step beside him and launched into a detailed account of something that had happened at recess the previous day involving a disputed rule in a game whose mechanics Nathan could not fully follow, but whose emotional stakes were clearly significant. He listened the way he always listened to her. Not half attending while his mind ran parallel tracks, but actually listening because she could tell the difference and because it mattered to him that she could tell the difference. He'd learned that from her, actually, the specific quality of attention a person could feel. He'd been trying to practice it in conference rooms. The Midwest Operations Modernization Initiative came back to the board in April, with Carter Blythe's supplemental impact assessment attached, and it was a different document from the original presentation in the way that a photograph is different from a description of what the photograph contains. The assessment had names. It had specifics. It had a woman named Dolores Varga, 58 years old, 22 years with the company's Joliet facility, whose husband was on dialysis and whose health coverage came entirely through her employment. It had a man named Ray Hutchins, 44, who had come back from a rotator cuff surgery 9 months ago and was still in the modified duty category that made him effectively non-hireable at other distribution operations. It had a single mother named Brianna Locke, 31, who had 2 kids in school and whose shift schedule at the warehouse was the only childcare arrangement that was financially viable for her family. It had 47 other specific cases in the representative sample, selected, Nathan had requested this specifically, to reflect the range of circumstances within the workforce rather than the median, because the median was where averages hid the people who couldn't absorb a shock. Carter Blythe presented it with less confidence than he'd presented the original proposal, which Nathan thought was probably the most honest thing Carter Blythe had done in a professional context in some time, and which he respected more than he'd expected to. When Blythe finished, Judith Faraday said, "This changes the calculus on the transition package." "Significantly," Nathan said. Claire looked at the table. "What do we need to make this work without Dolores Varga losing her husband's health care coverage?" What followed was 2 hours that were not smooth. People disagreed. One board member, a man named Gerald Holt, who had the effect of someone who had been right in rooms for a long time and found disagreement physically uncomfortable, said that the company could not be in the business of designing benefit structures around individual circumstances, and that this was precisely the kind of thinking that made businesses uncompetitive. Nathan looked at him. "We're not talking about individual circumstances," he said. "We're talking about a pattern. If 47 people in a representative sample have healthcare vulnerabilities connected to this transition, then you have a systemic problem in your transition plan, not 47 individual problems. Fixing the plan is a business decision, not a charity decision." Gerald Holt looked at Nathan with the expression of a man who had come to regard Nathan as a persistent headache and had not yet decided what to do about that. "The numbers don't support," Holt started. "The numbers don't include the cost of wrongful termination exposure if someone can demonstrate that the transition package was inadequate relative to the documented health circumstances that the company was aware of," Nathan said, "which they now can demonstrate because Carter's team documented it." He looked at Blythe. "No criticism. I asked for the documentation. I'm just saying the documentation creates a legal context as well as a moral one." Judith Faraday said calmly, "He's right about the exposure." Holt sat back. He was not convinced. Nathan had come to understand that Holt was not going to be convinced by any single argument. He was going to have to be outlasted, and outlasting people was something Nathan had more patience for than most. Claire proposed a modified transition, phased automation over 24 months instead of 12, an extended healthcare bridge for workers within 7 years of Medicare eligibility, a retraining fund with actual cost of living stipends, rather than vouchers that assumed the workers had discretionary income to draw on, and a job placement partnership with 3 regional distribution companies that had already agreed in principle to prioritize Harrington Global workers in their hiring. The vote was 9-3 in favor. Gerald Holt was one of the 3. He looked at Nathan on the way out of the boardroom with the expression of a man filing something away for later. Nathan met his eyes and held them long enough to communicate that he was not concerned, then went to get coffee. Judith Faraday caught up with him at the coffee station by the window. She was 70 years old and had the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where posture communicated something. "You're getting better at this," she said, which was both a compliment and an observation, and which Judith probably delivered as the same thing. "I'm learning the room," he said. "You learned the room in January. Now you're learning when to push and when to let the argument carry itself." She poured her own coffee. Black, no ceremony. "Gerald is going to be a problem." "I know." He was close to Victor. Nathan looked at her. How close? She held his look for a moment. That's the question I'd be asking, she said, and walked away. He stood at the window with his coffee and thought about what she'd said, and what she'd meant by saying it, and looked out at the April city below, the streets showing the particular energy of a place waking up from cold, and filed the information in the same place he kept other things he'd need later. He told Claire that evening. They'd developed over the 4 months since January a habit of talking at the end of the day. Not every day, not formally, but often enough that it had become a pattern they'd both stopped pretending wasn't a pattern. Sometimes it was by phone. Sometimes, when the board schedule meant Nathan was still in the building at 6 or 7, it was in her office with the lake view going dark outside the windows and takeout containers on the low table between the chairs. Those evenings had a specific quality. The building was mostly empty by then, the executive floor quiet, and they talked differently than they did in meetings or on calls. Less structured, more honest. The way people talk when they're tired and the performance of the day has wound down. He told her things. Not everything, not all at once. He wasn't built for that kind of rapid disclosure, and she hadn't pushed for it. But things. About the teams, about the years overseas, about the particular difficulty of coming back to a civilian world that moved at a different speed and cared about different things. About Sophie's mother, more than he'd said to anyone in a long time. About the guitar. She'd told him things too. About her father and the 12 employees and the 18 months that became 12, about the ways the company had changed her and the ways she'd let it change her, and the ways she hadn't noticed until recently which changes were which. About the night she'd found Victor's records. Not just the money, but a folder of communications that showed he'd been maneuvering against her for years, small calculated things, the kind of damage that's done by someone who smiles in every meeting. Did you see it coming? Nathan had asked once. She'd thought about it honestly. I saw things I didn't interpret correctly, she said. I mistook competence for loyalty. I thought the company was the shared interest. I didn't account for the fact that someone could be excellent at their job and entirely self-serving at the same time. I've known people like that, he said. Soldiers? People, he said. The uniform doesn't change the math. Tonight she was still at her desk when he came in, which meant the day had been long. She looked up when he knocked on the open door and gestured toward the chairs without stopping what she was writing. He sat down and waited. She finished the paragraph, or whatever it was, set the pen down, and looked at him. Judith flagged Gerald Holt, he said. Her expression didn't change much, but she went still in the particular way she did when something landed that she'd been half expecting. She talked to you directly. At the coffee station. She didn't say anything explicit. She said he was close to Victor and that he was going to be a problem, and then she left me to think about what that meant. What did it mean? That I should find out how close, Nathan said, and that Judith probably already knows the answer and wanted me to ask the question so it didn't come from her. Claire picked up her pen again, not to write, just to have something in her hand. Victor's attorneys have been unusually cooperative with certain board members in terms of information sharing. We don't know what that information is. She looked at the pen. Dennis has been looking at it. How long? 6 weeks. He looked at her. You didn't tell me. I didn't have anything to tell. I had a suspicion and an ongoing investigation. She met his eyes. I'm telling you now. He thought about what it meant. Victor in pretrial detention with attorneys who were talking to board members. A vote that had gone 9-3 today, with Holt on the losing side. Judith Faraday filing information across a coffee station with the casual precision of someone who had been navigating rooms like this one for longer than Nathan had been alive. What does Dennis have? He asked. Enough to ask questions, not enough to take to the board yet. She set the pen down. If Gerald Holt was receiving information from Victor's accounts during the period of the fraud, even passively, even without direct participation, his position on the board becomes untenable. And if he was actively participating? Then we have a different conversation. She looked at him steadily. I need you to stay close to Judith, not as a spy. She'd see through that and she'd close. As what you already are to her, which is someone she's decided to take seriously. She takes you seriously, Nathan said. Judith takes results seriously. She's watched me manage the last 4 months and she's reserving judgment, which from Judith is practically an endorsement. She paused. But she talked to you today, not me. That means something. He thought about the 70-year-old woman with the perfect posture and the black coffee and the economy of her language. She wants the company to survive, he said. She doesn't particularly care who gets credit for it surviving. No, Claire said. She doesn't. They sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the city had gone fully dark, the lake invisible again, the lights of the North Shore blinking across the water. I've been thinking about the building, Nathan said. She looked at him. The shift in subject didn't throw her shake. She'd gotten used to the way he moved between things. The co-op structure. The legal work is done. Construction starts in May. He crossed his arms. Amika asked me last week if it was real, not rudely. He's seen things fall through before. He wanted to know if this was the kind of promise that was made once and then forgotten. What did you tell him? I told him to ask you himself. He looked at her. He will. Probably in the next week or two. I want you to be ready for that conversation, and I want you to have it without a PR person in the room. Something moved in her expression. Not irritation, closer to the feeling of being known well enough to be held accountable. He'd noticed she didn't like that feeling, not because she wanted to avoid accountability, but because she was still learning to sit with the exposure of it. I'll talk to him, she said, without the PR person. And Mrs. P, he said. She's been watching to see if the building meeting was the last time you showed up. I know. She looked at the desk. She stopped. Busy, he said. Not as an excuse, not as a criticism either, just as the word. There's always something, she said. Something that needs me and can't wait. And the building feels like the thing that can wait because nothing is actively on fire there right now. She looked at him. I know that's exactly how I made the mistake in the first place. Yeah, he said. I'll go this week, she said. Thursday. I'll come with you. She looked at him. There was a particular thing that happened between them sometimes, a moment where the professional context and the other thing, the thing neither of them had named yet, occupied the same space at the same time, and both of them acknowledged it without addressing it. Like two people in a room deciding by mutual silent agreement to leave a particular door closed for now. Okay, she said. Thursday. They went on Thursday. Emeka was home. His wife Adaeze was there too, a woman Nathan had spoken to only briefly before, who had the watchful quality of someone who had been disappointed by institutions enough times to require specific evidence before trusting them. Claire sat at their kitchen table, the Okafor kitchen, which was smaller than Nathan's and which smelled like something warm and spiced that had been on the stove long enough to settle into the walls. And she answered Emeka's questions without corporate language, which Nathan suspected was harder for her than it looked, and which she managed because she'd been practicing. The questions were not easy ones. Amika asked about the legal structure of the co-op, and what happened if Harrington Global decided in 5 years that the arrangement was inconvenient. Claire explained the title transfer and the legal protections in language that was specific enough to be answerable, but not so technical it turned into a wall. He asked about the renovation. Which contractors? What oversight? What recourse if the work was substandard? She had answers. She'd done the work. Adaeze was quiet through most of it. At the end she said, My children are going to grow up in this building. Yes, Claire said. You understand what that means. Not as a policy statement. You understand what it means. Claire looked at her. I understand better than I did 4 months ago, she said. I don't think I can tell you I understand it fully. I grew up differently. She paused. What I can tell you is that I've sat in a lot of rooms lately thinking about what Sophie Cole's name looked like on a prescription bottle, and it's changed what I can look at without seeing it clearly. Adaeze looked at Nathan. Something passed between them. 2 parents, 2 people who understood the specific weight of children who depended on them. And she looked back at Claire. All right, she said. It sounded like Mrs. P's all right, the one that meant one chance. Mrs. P was in the lobby on the way out, as if she'd timed it, which Nathan suspected she had. She was in her day clothes this time, a gray cardigan and dark trousers, and she looked at Claire with the full force of 81 years of accumulated judgment. The construction people, she said. They better not make that noise before 8 in the morning. "I'll put it in the contract," Claire said. Mrs. P looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "You can come back," which in her register was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation, and went back to her apartment. Claire stood in the lobby and let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since the Okafor kitchen. "That was harder than the board meeting," she said. "Yes," Nathan said. "It should be." She looked at him. He looked back. The lobby buzzing overhead, the mailboxes along the wall, the crack in the plaster that he'd finally gotten around to filling in March. Everything the same and different. The before and after with no clear seam between them. She reached out and touched his arm. Just that. Her hand on his jacket sleeve for a second. Not quite a handhold, not quite nothing either. "Thank you," she said. "For this. For all of it." He thought about what to say. He thought about the range of things that were true and the question of which ones were ready to be said out loud. "Buy me coffee sometime," he said. "The good kind, not the conference room stuff." The corner of her mouth moved. "Saturday morning?" "Sophie's got a thing with Marty Saturday morning." "Saturday morning," she said, like it was decided. Victor Lang's trial began in September and lasted 11 days. Nathan didn't attend. He had work, and he wasn't a witness, and he'd found that following the daily coverage was enough. The financial fraud case was airtight. The conspiracy charge related to the crash took longer because intent was harder to prove than wire transfers, but Dennis had located the man who'd made the phone call Victor made that night, and that man had made a deal. And the deal meant that Victor sat in a courtroom and heard the specific details of what he'd arranged read into the record. He was convicted on 49 of 52 fraud counts and on the conspiracy charge, sentenced in November. Nathan read the news on his phone at his kitchen table while Sophie did homework across from him, and Marcus sat beside her grading her work, apparently. He thought about a highway and a blizzard, about tire marks disappearing under snow, about the particular math of a moment, the Civic rolling past the guardrail gap, his foot on the brake, the 7 seconds of sitting still before he got out of the car. He thought about all the things that had been in motion that night without his knowing. Claire's phone call to Victor, Victor's phone call to a man whose name Nathan now knew, a black car accelerating through a blizzard toward a silver Mercedes. Sophie at home in the apartment, asleep with her rabbit, the eviction notice on the door, all of that in motion, converging in 30 feet of tire tracks in the snow. He'd almost kept driving. He needed to remember that. He'd almost kept driving, and the part of him that had almost kept driving wasn't a bad part. It was the part that was exhausted and frightened and running the math on survival, and that math was real. The $3.17 was real. The missed shift was real. The part of him that stopped was not the saintly part, not the heroic part. It was just the part that couldn't leave someone at the bottom of a ravine and live with knowing he'd made that choice. Most people, he'd come to think, had that part. They just got to different amounts of tired at different rates. "Dad," Sophie said. He looked up. She had her pencil raised and the expression of someone who had been trying to get his attention for a moment. "What's 8 times 7?" she asked. 56. She wrote it down, checked it, erased it, and wrote it again more neatly. "You were thinking about something," she said. "Yeah." "The storm?" He looked at her. She was perceptive in ways that sometimes still caught him off guard. "Little bit," he said. She nodded. She'd grown into the knowledge of that night gradually, in pieces, the way children absorb family history, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a story that existed in the background and came forward in increments. She knew her father had pulled someone out of a car. She knew that person was Claire. She knew about the medication and the eviction notice, because he'd told her the age-appropriate version of both, because she'd asked and she deserved answers that were honest even if they were simplified. She knew that her lungs were better, that the building had people in charge of it now who cared whether the radiator worked, that her father went to an office building sometimes and came home looking tired in a different way than the warehouse tired, less depleted, more like someone who'd been in a fight that was worth having. She knew that Claire came over for dinner sometimes, that those evenings were different from other evenings in a way that Sophie had registered without commenting on, which meant she was either preserving their privacy or gathering evidence, possibly both. "Is Claire coming Saturday?" Sophie asked. "We're getting coffee Saturday morning. Just you and her? You'll be with Marty. Sophie appeared to consider the implications of this information. She had Marcus's ear between her fingers in the way she did when she was thinking. That's like a date, she said. It's coffee. It's coffee without me, she said, which is different. He looked at her. Does that bother you? She thought about it with genuine seriousness, not performed consideration. 8 years old, and she thought about things like they mattered, which they did. No, she said finally. She's good. She listens when I talk. She went back to her homework. She's not trying to be my mom or anything. She's just herself. Yeah, he said. She is. Sophie wrote something else in her notebook. You should tell her you like her, she said, with the absolute pragmatism of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of saying true things. I'll keep that in mind. You've been thinking about it for like 4 months, she said. That's long enough. He looked at his daughter. She was not looking at him. She was writing, pencil moving, Marcus supervising. And she had the particular self-satisfaction of someone who had said the necessary thing and was now done with it. He thought, there it is. Yet, Saturday morning was gray and cool, the kind of October morning that felt like a reasonable temperature after what summer had done. The coffee shop was 3 blocks from the Harrington Global building. Neutral territory, Claire had said, and he'd said he didn't know why they needed neutral territory for coffee. And she'd said, yes, you do, and he'd laughed and she'd laughed, and they'd agreed on the place without another word about it. She was there before him. This surprised him. He'd assumed she'd be late because she was always managing 12 things. But she was at a table by the window with 2 coffees already, which meant she'd arrived early enough to order for both of them, which meant she'd had to guess. He sat down and looked at the cup. Black. I figured, she said. Yeah. He picked it up. You're early. I'm always early. I just don't show it at the office because arriving early to your own building is embarrassing. He looked at her over the cup. She was in weekend clothes, dark jeans, a gray sweater, hair down, and the small difference of it from her professional presentation was strange in a way that wasn't bad. She looked like someone who existed outside the building, which seemed obvious but which he'd needed to see with his own eyes. Gerald Holt resigned last week, she said. I saw. Dennis found what we were looking for. Holt wasn't an active participant in the fraud. He didn't know the details, but he was receiving quarterly payments through a consulting arrangement that Victor set up and that Holt had to know was irregular. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. His attorney negotiated a quiet exit from the board in exchange for full cooperation with the prosecution. No criminal charges. Is that the right outcome? She thought about it. Probably not the just one, she said. But it was the useful one. His testimony closes the last gap in the fraud timeline. She looked at the window. I keep trying to figure out if I'm learning to compromise the right things or just getting better at rationalizing. That's the right question to keep asking, he said. You'd tell me if I stopped asking it. I would. That's the whole arrangement, basically, she said. You stay in those rooms and you tell me when I stop asking the right questions. It's a little more complicated than that at this point, he said. She looked at him. They'd been circling this for months, not clumsily, not with the specific awkwardness of people who didn't know what they wanted, but carefully, the way you circle something when you're not sure the ground around it is solid. He was sure enough now. He thought she was too. Sophie thinks I should tell you I like you, he said. Claire blinked. Then something happened in her face that he hadn't seen before. Not the controlled almost smile, not the performance of composure, but something genuinely unguarded. She told you that? 3 days ago, over homework. She was very matter-of-fact about it. She's been very matter-of-fact about most things. She gets it from someone. He looked at her. I like you, Claire. That's separate from the work and the building and all of it. I like you the way you are when you're not managing anything. He paused. Which is also the way you are when you are managing things, mostly. But you know what I mean. She was quiet for a moment. The coffee shop was moderately full, other people having their own Saturday mornings, indifferent to this particular table. I like you, she said. I have been not saying it because I wasn't sure if the situation made it. She searched for the word. Complicated, he offered. Everything about us is complicated. Yeah, he said. I know. I knocked the check out of my hand, she said. I tried to fix everything at once. I've been... She stopped, organized herself. I'm aware that the power differential between us is real, even if I want to pretend it isn't. I'm your employer, technically, and you're in that building because I'm your employer. And there's no version of that dynamic that's uncomplicated. He looked at her. You think I'd still be in that building if I didn't want to be? She thought about it. No, she said. You'd have left. I'd have left the first time Gerald Holt tried to schedule a follow-up meeting instead of answering a question, he said. That was February. I'm still there. Because the work matters. Because the work matters, and because I want to come into the building every day, he said. Both of those things are true. She held his look. Outside the window, a woman walked past with a dog and a stroller, the dog interested in everything, the baby asleep, the woman navigating both with the practiced competence of someone who had gotten very good at managing more than one thing at once. I'm not good at this, Claire said. I want you to know that up front. I've been running a company since I was 26, and I have not been good at... She made a gesture with her coffee cup that covered a range of interpersonal territory. Any of this. I work too much. I go quiet when I'm stressed. I cancel things and then feel bad and then don't say I feel bad because saying I feel bad seems weak. I know, he said. You know, and you're still sitting here. I missed a shift in a blizzard for a stranger, he said. My threshold for difficult is not where most people's is. She laughed. The full version. The one that was surprised out of her, that came from somewhere real. He thought about a kitchen with a cracked ceiling and a radiator that worked half the time, and a prescription bottle on the counter with a child's name on it. He thought about the embankment and the flashlight and the 7 seconds of sitting still. He thought about all the ways a life could turn on a moment small enough to miss, a guardrail gap, a foot on a brake, a choice made not out of heroism, but out of being unable to live with the alternative. He thought about Sophie saying, "You've been thinking about it for like 4 months. That's long enough." And the absolute accuracy of that, and the particular grace of being known by someone who told you what they saw without making you feel judged for taking so long. Okay, Claire said. Okay, he said. They drank their coffee in the warm interior of a Saturday morning, and outside the October city moved around them, indifferent and alive, the lake somewhere behind the buildings doing what it always did, which was exist on a scale that made human worry seem appropriately sized, not small, just sized correctly, against something large enough to hold it. He thought, you don't get to know, in the moment, which moments matter. You don't get to know when you stop the car and grab the flashlight and go over a guardrail in the dark, that this is the one. You just do it because you can't not, and then your life rearranges itself around the fact of what you did, and you live in the rearranged version, and it's harder than the other version would have been, and better, and more like the thing you were actually supposed to be doing all along. Nathan Cole had $3.17 in a bank account on the worst night of the year and a daughter who needed medicine and a job he was about to lose. And he stopped anyway. Not because he knew what it would become, because he was the kind of person who stopped. That was the whole story, really. Everything else was just what came after. The building on South Paulina got its renovation in May and June, section by section. The tenants staying in their apartments while the walls came open and the pipes got replaced and the radiators were updated to units that worked without negotiation. Mrs. P complained about the noise twice, both times before 8 in the morning, both times correctly, and the contractor adjusted. The Okafor children had a stretch of wall in the second-floor hallway where they left handprints in the wet paint, which someone discovered too late to sand off, and which Claire, when informed, said should stay. Sophie finished 3rd grade and started 4th. Her lungs stabilized to the point where Dr. Wynne, at the June appointment, used the word encouraging, which was a word Nathan wrote in the Notes app on his phone and looked at periodically on days that needed it. Marcus the rabbit remained in good health and continued to hold opinions. Victor Lang's sentencing was covered briefly in the business press and at length in the specific corner of Nathan's attention that he gave to things he needed to know were finished. 14 years. Not enough, maybe, for a man who'd arranged for a car to run someone off a highway in a blizzard, but finite. A number with an end. Nathan sat in board meetings in January and February and April and every month after, and he asked questions that made Carter Blythe increasingly better at anticipating them, which Nathan considered a success. He developed a working relationship with Judith Faraday that consisted mostly of brief conversations at coffee stations and an unspoken agreement that they were both watching the same things for the same reasons. He remained, contractually, able to raise any concern about any initiative, and he used that contractual right regularly, and nobody tried to schedule a follow-up meeting in lieu of an answer, and so he stayed. He and Claire had coffee on Saturday mornings when their schedules allowed. They argued about things, real arguments, the kind that didn't resolve cleanly and required returning to, about the pace of the South Side remediation, about a new acquisition that Nathan thought moved too fast and Claire thought moved too slowly, about a personnel decision that he felt she'd made from the head and she felt he'd made from the gut, and both of them being partly right. They were not a smooth story. They were a difficult one, with better days and worse ones, and they had enough of both to know the difference. He never told her what he'd been thinking on that embankment. He didn't think she needed to know. What she needed to know, she could see, that he was still there, that he showed up, that when she was wrong, he said so. That was the arrangement. That was all it had ever needed to be. And sometimes, on the Saturdays when Sophie was with Marty and the city was doing its slow October thing outside the coffee shop window, or on the evenings when they sat in Claire's office with the lake going dark and talked about things that weren't on any agenda, it was more than an arrangement. It was just the life that had come from the choice. From the night someone saw a guardrail gap in a blizzard and didn't keep driving. From the particular unglamorous human stubbornness of a man who could not look away.